Okay, welcome to cells and to specifically the cell theory, or how we approach looking at cells and how we know what is alive and isn't alive. So we've been talking a lot about in class the characteristics of life, and then we talked about how we classify life. And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of the 6 characteristics of life, which are cells. We're going to be diving into what different cells look like on the inside, what the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes are. And we're also going to be looking at the cells inside of our own bodies, our cheek cells and our skin cells. So in order to do that, we first kind of need to look at a little bit of the information related to the history of how scientists discovered cells. So this is going to take you through the history of cells and how we got to know a little bit about how cells form and things like that. Before we begin, though, I just want to point out to you a couple interesting random cell facts that I think might really be beneficial to you as you kind of think about your own cells and the cells inside of your body. So if we take a look at that first fact there, it says the average human being is composed of over or around 100 trillion individual cells. That's a very big number. It's difficult to kind of conceptualize in our brains, but we're made up of over 100 trillion. The cool thing is that we all started as just one single cell, and we've grown to have over 100 trillion of them. The other interesting fact I threw down there is it would take as many as 50 cells to cover the area of a dot in the letter I. So you can see how small that little dot is down there, and if we were to try to cover that with cells, we could put as many as 50 cells in there and still not be able to see it. We would have to use a microscope for it. So let's dive into some of the history and interesting things related to cells. First person we want to talk about is Robert Hooke. Now, in 1665, English scientist Robert Hooke discovered cells while looking into a thin slice of cork. He did this by using what's called a microscope. The microscopes they used back then was a series of different lenses that were put together. So what exactly is it that Robert Hooke discovered? Well, he discovered actual cells by looking at those slices of cork. And what he noticed was they looked like teeny boxes or little honeycomb squares. Hence why we use the word cells to determine these things. And the reason why they were given the name cells was because they kind of reminded Robert Hooke of the little cells or little rooms that prisoners were put in 1665. After looking at this, he only thought that cells existed in plants and fungi. So we really didn't get into animals yet, hadn't looked at human cells or any of those kind of cells like that. Now, moving forward in history, let's talk about Anton van Leeuwenhoek. Anton van Leeuwenhoek is going to be kind of one of the many people that were involved in the process of discovering and creating and inventing the microscope. In 1673, van Leeuwenhoek used one of his own handmade microscopes to observe pond scum. So he went out to the local pond, took some of that little film off the top of the pond, and what he noticed or discovered were single-celled organisms. And they kind of looked like these things over here. And they moved around. And they looked all different shapes and sizes, and because they reminded him of miniature or small animals, he called them animalcules, or small or miniature versions of animals. Now, he also observed blood cells from fish, birds, frogs, dogs, and humans, and he noticed that there were patterns in different shapes and sizes there. And from these discoveries that Anton van Leeuwenhoek made, we get the understanding that cells were also found in animals in addition to plants and fungi. So now we've got animals, plants, fungi that we know that cells are in. Now, after van Leeuwenhoek, we have this 150 to 200 year gap where there really wasn't any major movements or discoveries in the understanding of cells. And most of that was due to this widespread traditional belief of spontaneous generation, where basically scientists believe, because of what they observed, that cells arose from non-existent life. So, for example, they noticed or observed that mice were usually found growing or kind of being around dirty clothes or husks, and they also noticed that maggots were found on rotting meat. One of the interesting little stories about this is that if you were to put out a piece of meat on a counter and let it rot, you would eventually see maggots form. And for scientists back then, observing a raw piece of meat rotting on a counter and turning into maggots, they didn't realize where those maggots were coming from. So they were thinking that you had life arising from no life. So after that 200 or so year gap, we do have some more advancements thanks to Louis Pasteur. Now, you may have heard of the pasteurization or how we pasteurize our milk, but Louis Pasteur is known for actually discovering a process to remove bacteria and contamination from milk amongst other liquids. And because of his discoveries, he actually helped, along with Robert Koch, to disprove that spontaneous generation actually occurred. And he did this by setting up a closed environment around meat where nothing could attack the meat as it rotted, and we realized that nothing grew in the meat. So he was able to disprove spontaneous generation and get scientists thinking again a little bit about cells, where cells come from, and how cells work. Now, what we have is what's called the now modern understanding of the cell theory. There are multiple scientists that were involved in this process, including in 1838, German botanist Matthias Schleiden, who concluded that all plants are made of cells. So he took the work of previous scientists and summarized it in a new way with new technology. And a friend of his, a year later, German physiologist Theodor Schwann, also kind of summarized some of the earlier works of van Leeuwenhoek or other scientists and noted that animal tissues and animals in general are also composed of cells. Now, these were kind of obvious statements. Most people already kind of knew this and agreed on this, so this wasn't anything groundbreaking or new. It wasn't until our next scientist in 1858, notice that we have an addition of 15 to 20 years there, where Rudolf Virchow, a German physician, actually began to look at how cells actually turn into new cells. And what he noticed is that all cells must arise from pre-existing cells. So this kind of was the final debunking of spontaneous generation, where life must arise from life. We can't have non-life from arising to give life. So this is kind of our way of looking at this. These are kind of some of the interesting things that he actually got to see under the microscope that we too will also be able to see as we move through the year. Now, what does the complete cell theory look like? Well, there's three basic components that we want to know and understand when it comes to the cell theory. The first is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. The second is that cells are the basic unit of life of all living things. And the third thing is all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. You may look at this and go, there's nothing groundbreaking or shattering here. However, looking at the dates in the mid-1800s, this was groundbreaking and earth-rattling. Today, we kind of take this for granted. Please note that today we also know that all cells also contain DNA, which is something new that has kind of been added to the cell theory, the modern cell theory, so to speak. So these are the three basic components of the cell theory you definitely want to know or be able to reproduce for assessment purposes. This is our overview of the cell theory. After this, now we're going to be able to break out and talk about prokaryotes and eukaryotes and animal cells and plant cells and all that kind of stuff like that. In addition, I've also attached a cool little video that will probably help you to remember these three things. So definitely take a moment to check that out.